Great. Well, thank you so much to the seminar organisers and for all of you here today for allowing me the opportunity to present my paper, Shared Culture and Technological Innovation, Evidence from Corporate R&D Teams. This is joint work with my colleague, Xiaoding Liu at Texas A&M University, and we'd appreciate your questions and comments at any time, especially this is the first time we presented this externally. So definitely appreciate any thoughts that you have and look forward to Francesco's discussion. So to provide some background motivation for our paper, over the last several decades, we have seen the rising importance of technological innovation in driving the real economy through its impact on productivity and aggregate output. And concurrent with this, there have been sort of two major trends that have shaped the development of today's innovation landscape. So the first defining feature of the modern knowledge economy is the rising importance of teamwork amongst inventors in spurring new technological progress. And so there have been several drivers of this phenomenon, but one key reason for this emphasis on teamwork is how it helps to alleviate the cost of the so-called knowledge burden faced by individual inventors. So as discussed in Jones 2009, if we understand technological progress as building upon mankind's existing base of knowledge, then we can see that successive generations of inventors will face an increasing education or knowledge burden associated with understanding and hopefully improving upon this existing base of knowledge. And so importantly, rather than sort of face these challenges alone, many inventors are increasingly more likely to collaborate with one another in the hope that teams of inventors can combine their respective skills and experiences to hopefully pursue new innovative research endeavors. And then the second key trend that we've seen with today's innovation landscape is that there's been a conscious emphasis on the part of government regulators, private corporations, and institutional investors to implement policies that promote greater workplace diversity across several dimensions, such as cultural background and gender identity. And so, for example, not only are government prohibitions against discriminatory employment practices fairly universal worldwide, we're also seeing that many of the world's largest corporations are taking active steps to increase employee diversity. For example, through the creation of chief diversity officer or equivalent positions. So for example, amongst approximately half of the S&P 500 firms have created such chief diversity officer positions. As well as we're also seeing many of the largest companies publishing corporate guidelines and statistics that directly measure a firm's diversity performance. And so similarly, many of the world's largest asset managers and proxy advisory firms, such as BlackRock, State Street, Global Advisors, Glass Lewis, have implemented proxy voting guidelines that mandate certain levels of board diversity to be met by their portfolio firms. For example, at least one or two women must be present on part of the portfolio firm's board of directors. And so given these two clear trends in the modern knowledge economy, in this paper, we seek to investigate what the intersection of these two trends in terms of increased inventor teamwork and workplace diversity means for both inventor team formation and skilled labor productivity. So in particular, our two main research questions are, first, what factors drive the collaboration decisions of inventors? So in other words, the so-called inventor team formation question. And so here we want to consider the relative importance of individual inventors' inherited traits, for example, cultural values and gender, versus inventors' acquired career experiences in driving their collaboration decisions of which other inventors to work with. And then our second main research question is, how does inventor team diversity impact a team's innovation output? Or in other words, the inventor team productivity question. And so here we want to consider the effect of inventor team diversity on different types of innovation, as well as the effect of inventor team diversity on the distribution of possible innovation outcomes. So interestingly, despite the substantial economic, corporate and policymaker interest in the relationship between employee diversity and technological innovation, there are a number of unanswered questions about how diversity in inherited characteristics, so for example, diversity in cultural values, affects inventor team formation and employee productivity. So with respect to inventor team formation, the prior literature has found evidence of homophily, namely the tendency of individuals to prefer to work with others who have similar personal or social characteristics in other business-related contexts. So for example, in the formation of venture capital syndicates, as well as corporate director networks. However, to the best of our knowledge, there has been no other study that has conducted a large-scale analysis of the relative importance of inherited characteristics, such as cultural values, versus acquired career experiences in explaining inventor collaboration decisions. So in particular, the prior literature has primarily focused on team output as opposed to how inventor teams form in the first place, which we think is an important question in and of itself from both an academic and policy perspective, because it speaks to whether more structured R&D corporate workplace environments with similar sort of training regimes and corporate policies attenuates any potential homophily biases that may form in the workplace, as well as speaks to the ultimate effectiveness of diversity hiring policies in promoting more diverse teams. And then with respect to diversity and performance, there is much conflicting empirical evidence on more general questions, such as whether corporate board diversity has a positive or a negative impact on firm performance, whether investor diversity has a positive or negative impact on investment performance, and whether employee diversity does or does not promote firm innovation. However, furthermore, exists very little evidence on the direct question of how inventor team diversity impacts innovation output, which we believe is a crucial question from the perspective of many stakeholders, given the unclear long-term economic effects of both government and corporate policies, which are designed to increase workplace diversity. So we believe that this sort of lack of clarity in the prior academic literature about the drivers of both employee team formation and inventor team productivity stems from two key empirical issues. So the first is the very challenging issues associated with the measurement of team membership, group diversity, and team productivity. So for example, it is often difficult to identify who are the members of the relevant team. So for example, when studying firm level innovation outcomes, it is unclear whether firm management diversity, board of director diversity, and or overall firm-wide diversity should be the appropriate unit of team level analysis. And then relatedly, even if one can identify the members of the focal team, it is often impossible to obtain individual team member data on a large scale, particularly in relation to both their inherited traits and their acquired career experiences, due to a lack of publicly available information and or issues with privacy or confidentiality concerns. And then finally, even if we acquire enough information about the relevant team members, it is often difficult to measure the specific output of the focal team. So for example, in relation to questions about the impact of board of director diversity on corporate innovation, how much credit should the board of directors get for each individual patent that is developed by the inventors at the firm? And so these sort of combined measurement issues have resulted in prior studies either focusing on highly endogenous firm level relationships or studying more niche data sets that might have limited generalizability. And then second, just as important, if not even more important than these measurement issues, are the formidable endogeneity issues stemming from the challenge in identifying a valid counterfactual control group to compare with the focal team, as well as the ever-present difficulty of disentangling causal treatment effects from selection effects, which may arise due to the endogenous matching of organizations and employees, as well as the effect of unobserved moderating factors at both the firm level and at the CEO level. So therefore, in contrast to prior studies that have generally focused on highly endogenous firm level relationships, we focus our analysis on understanding the formation and productivity of distinct inventor teams within the same firm at the same point in time. And so this empirical design, we believe, allows us to address many of the measurement issues and endogeneity issues that have plagued much of the prior literature on this topic. So first, we use detailed USPTO patent data and other resources to objectively identify the core members of a corporate R&D team that contributed to the development of a new specific patentable technology, as well as trace the career history and personal characteristics of millions of individual inventors and inventor teams over several decades. Second, this setting allows us to have a natural comparison sample of counterfactual inventors, because we only compare inventor teams that work at the same firm and thus has similar access to corporate resources, financing, etc., at the same point in time. So let's face similar technological and competitive landscape. And in some specifications also work at the same corporate office, which helps us to account for any issues associated with local labor markets or local economic conditions. And so as a result, we argue that this setting allows us to more cleanly identify the relative importance of inventors' inherited characteristics, such as cultural values, vis-a-vis acquired career experiences in driving both inventor team formation and its effect on inventor team productivity. And then finally, as I will discuss later in this presentation, we not only address these potential endogeneity issues using these implicit firm, year, and geographic fixed effects, but we also use premature co-inventor deaths to generate plausible exogenous variation in the cultural composition of inventor teams. And so this will allow us then to generate credibly causal estimates of the effect of inventor team diversity on our team innovative output. And so using our unique empirical design to examine over 1.2 million collaborations formed between 1981 and 2011 between pairs of US-based inventors at US publicly listed firms, we first provide novel evidence that inherited affinity-based traits such as cultural values and shared gender play a critical role in observed inventor team formation. So for example, we find that two similarly experienced inventors currently working at the same firm in the same corporate office are 6 to 8% more likely to collaborate with one another if they share similar cultural values. And similarly, we find that two similarly experienced inventors working at the same corporate office are 8 to 10% more likely to work with female inventors are 8 to 10% more likely to work with other female inventors, even if they work at the same corporate office. And so these affinity-based characteristics are robust across several empirical specifications, and in terms of economic significance, are at least as important as a potential collaborator's prior technical experience in explaining an inventor's collaboration decisions. And so given this sort of large-scale evidence documenting the strong preferences of firm R&D employees to collaborate with one another that possess similar personal characteristics, such as shared cultural values, we next examine the important question about whether these familiarity biases in co-inventor network formation have a positive or a negative effect on team level productivity. And so in order to disentangle the selection effect from the treatment effect of inventor team diversity on team performance, we use a quasi-natural experiment involving premature co-inventor deaths that provides an exogenous source of variation in the cultural composition of inventor teams. And so interestingly, we find that the impact of a co-inventor's death on the surviving team depends in large part on the revised composition of the remaining team members' cultural backgrounds. So for surviving treated teams that experience a decrease in team cultural diversity, these teams significantly increase their overall patent production by shifting their focus to more incremental exploitation of existing technologies, thus producing a relatively higher share of moderately successful innovations. So in contrast, treated teams that experience an increase in the cultural diversity amongst their remaining team members tend to produce a higher share of more risky, more exploratory patents that have a relatively greater chance of becoming high impact innovations. And so this dichotomy is consistent with the conjecture that while diversity in inherited traits can impede information sharing and the integration of disparate viewpoints, a successful combination of differing perspectives amongst inventors can have a positive impact on the pursuit of technological innovation, particularly more high risk, high reward type innovations. And so we think that this is an interesting combined finding because our estimates would imply that inventor diversity has both positive and negative consequences for innovation production, and with the net overall effect depending on the type of innovation being pursued. So to provide just a little bit of background of what sort of areas I want to cover with the rest of the time we have remaining, I'll go through quickly sort of the data and the variables that we use for our analysis. Then we'll turn to the question of what drives inventor team formation, and then we'll examine the impact of different levels of diversity on inventor team productivity, and then sort of conclude with sort of the implications that we believe are important for policymakers and firms for our study. So the initial step in our empirical analysis involves identifying teams of inventors, their individual and team history, and their group patenting output. And so in order to do this, we proceed as follows. So first, we use a combination of USPTO, PatentsView, and the Berkeley Fung patent database to initially identify all patents that are developed by US-based inventors working at US publicly listed firms. And so the reason that we presently just focus on inventors working at public firms is because these larger publicly listed firms are more likely to have a sufficient pool of local individual inventors and inventor teams to facilitate the large scale within firm analysis that is the basis of our identification strategy. And then second, we use individual inventor ID codes and big data sort of techniques to identify all teams of 2+ inventors that ever collaborate on a patent to create unique team identifiers, which we then use to track team performance as well as individual patenting output from 1976 onwards. So after that, we then next construct inventors' inherited cultural characteristics following the methodology of my co-author Xiaoding in her 2016 Journal of Financial Economics paper. So in particular, we start with individual inventor surnames to identify the country of origin for approximately 90% of the US inventors in our initial sample. And then following the prior cultural literature, our main tests use the Hofstede 1980 framework, which classifies national culture into 6 dimensions, namely uncertainty avoidance, individualism, power distance, masculinity, long-term orientation, and indulgence, which we then use to compute the cultural value similarity amongst pairs or groups of inventors. And then, however, for robustness, we also use the alternative cultural frameworks of Schwartz 992, as well as the World Value Survey trust beliefs measures. In order to identify an inventor's gender, we rely on the USPTO's first name gender assignment algorithm as developed in Toole et al. 2019 and as reported in the PatentsView patent database. So in terms of innovation outcome variables, we follow the prior innovation literature and employ several patent-based measures at both the individual inventor and at the inventor team level to assess innovation productivity. So with respect to the quantity of innovation output in a given year, we use the total number of patents applied for in that year that are eventually granted. With respect to the average quality or value of an innovation, we use both the patent-based measure of scaled forward citations per patent, scaled by application year and CPC technology class, as well as the Kogan et al. 2017 measure of the average market value of eventually granted patents applied for in a particular year. So beyond patent counts and patent citations, we follow the work of March 1991 and also consider the relative focus on exploitative innovation, where exploitative innovation is the development of innovations that is closer to the existing body of work already done previously, versus more risky explorative innovation. So here we use two measures to assess an inventor team's relative focus on exploitative innovation. So first we use average backwards citations per patent following Balzheimer et al. 2017. And so here the rationale for this particular measure is that inventions that are being developed in more well-researched or crowded technological areas usually require a greater citation of the existing prior art in that area. And then our second measure of the relative focus of exploitative innovation is the average claims per patent following Balzheimer et al. 2017 again, on the basis that inventions where more claims are made are more correlated with greater efforts to distinguish the current innovation from prior innovations and are somewhat of a response to pressure for more immediate and quantifiable results. And then finally, we consider where each of the team's patents fall in the patent citation distribution by defining a high impact innovation measure, which is defined as a patent that receives citations that are within the highest decile or top 10% of the citation distribution for the same application year and CPC technology class. And so now let me turn to sort of the first sort of research question is what are the sort of key drivers of inventor team formation? So here, in order to measure the determinants of new pairwise collaborations between inventors employed at the same firm, we follow the methodology in Dyke et al., Benner and Lee, and Bereskin, and estimate the following conditional logit specification using cross-sectional data, where the dependent variable actual pair is equal to 1 if the inventor pair IJ represents a real first-time collaboration between inventor I and inventor J formed at a US publicly listed firm in year T. So this is sometimes referred to later in this presentation as the treated or the realized pair, and 0 otherwise. And so as I'll explain on the next slide, for each realized inventor pairing observation, there are 2 associated counterfactual co-inventor pair observations, which are sometimes also referred to as the control pair. And so as a result, group fixed effects in this context represent a fixed effect for each new realized pairing of co-inventors, and it's 2 counterfactual control pairs of potential, but ultimately unchosen co-inventors working at the same firm. So as such, our coefficient estimates are based on within-group variation in pairwise inventor characteristics. And so we focus our analysis on the very first collaboration between 2 individual US-based inventors, since the decision to collaborate for the first time is going to be unaffected by confounding factors such as experience with past collaborations or accumulated team-specific relationship capital. So in terms of independent right-hand side variables, our main variables of interest is the distance or dissimilarity between 2 inventors' cultural backgrounds, as well as an indicator for whether the 2 inventors in either the treated or the control pair are both female inventors. While we also include several control variables that capture the acquired experiences and other characteristics of the individual inventors in the pair. So for example, the geographic proximity between the 2 focal inventors, the similarity of the 2 inventors' prior professional experiences in terms of patenting output and technological classes previously patented in, as well as the length of tenure at the focal firm. And so as alluded to previously, in order to understand which factors significantly influence the formation of new collaborations between inventors, we utilize our unique within-firm corporate R&D setting to construct a plausible set of potential co-inventors who were available for collaboration at the time when the focal inventor decided to collaborate with a different co-inventor. And so this set of counterfactual inventors allows us to construct counterfactual pairs of firm inventors that, when compared against the set of realized first-time inventor collaborations, allows us to isolate the importance of affinity-based personal characteristics vis-a-vis acquired career experiences and other explanatory variables in driving the choice of co-inventor. So in order to implement this empirical strategy, we start by partnering each treated inventor, so labeled on the slide inventor T1 and inventor T2, with one potential but ultimately unchosen collaborator, labeled pseudo co-inventor C2 and pseudo co-inventor C1 respectively, that is most comparable to the actually chosen collaborator on the following dimensions. So first, the counterfactual co-inventor and the actual treated co-inventor must be currently employed at the same firm at the same point in time. Second, the counterfactual co-inventor must not have ever collaborated with either inventor in the treated pair prior to year T. And finally, to ensure comparability of innovation experience, we select the inventor with the closest number of eventually granted patent applications as the actually chosen co-inventor to serve as the counterfactual control inventors. And so as a result of implementing this procedure and merging in our culture and other inventor characteristic variables, we obtain a final pairwise data set of approximately 1.2 million treated pairs with an associated 2.3 million counterfactual control pairs. And so using this within firm identification strategy, we find strong evidence for homophily driving partnering decisions in internal skilled labor markets. So with respect to affinity-based characteristics, both shared culture and shared gender play a key role in employee decisions of which other company inventors to collaborate with. So for example, two inventors working at the same firm with relatively more disparate cultural origins are approximately 6 to 8% less likely to work with one another than two otherwise comparable colleagues with more similar cultural backgrounds. And similarly, we find that all else being equal, female inventors are 8 to 10% more likely to choose to collaborate with other female inventors working within the same firm. So with respect to other predictors of inventor team formation, we unsurprisingly find that relatively more successful inventors based on professional outcomes to date are relatively more likely to collaborate with one another, and also that inventors that are more geographically proximate to one another or have worked in similar technological fields before are also more likely to collaborate with one another in the future. And so I guess the key sort of takeaway message from this slide is that individual inventors are much more likely to collaborate with other inventors who share similar personal characteristics, for example, shared cultural values, irrespective of whether or not these traits are correlated with technical skills and or inherent ability. So while we claim that the use of these similarly accomplished inventors working at the same company at the same point in time is a valid comparison group for the treated pairs in our sample, we nevertheless test the robustness of our previous results by applying stricter filters in the construction of the counterfactual control pairs. So first, since geographic proximity seems to be an important driver of inventor partnering decisions, which may reflect differences in local economic conditions or other unobserved relationship-based characteristics, we specify that the potential but ultimately not chosen co-inventor must also be located at least within 50 miles of the actually treated co-inventor to proxy for the same office location. And so as can be seen in column 1 of this table, cultural similarity remains a strong predictor of inventor collaboration choices. Second, given the possibility that different divisions within a large corporation may have differential access to firm resources and inventor talent, we use an alternative counterfactual control sample where we only use potential co-inventors who work within the same division or subsidiary of the corporate firm at the same point in time. And again, as shown in column 2, shared sort of cultural values and shared gender still seem to be an important driver of inventor collaboration decisions. And then finally, our most restrictive counterfactual control sample requires potential pseudo-investors to work in the same division of the same company at the same point in time at the same corporate office. And so as shown in column 3, shared cultural values and shared gender remain critical determinants of inventor collaboration choices, even within the same corporate office. And so to provide a sense of the economic magnitude of our results, our estimates imply that shared cultural values are at least as important as the prior technical experience in explaining co-inventor matching. And so as such, it is clear that affinity-based characteristics such as shared cultural values are of first order importance in explaining the observed variation in inventor collaboration decisions, even in more standardized and regimented corporate R&D environments. So following on from these findings about the importance of inherited traits in driving inventor team formation, a natural question to explore is whether these familiarity biases enhance or impede different types of innovative output at the team level. And so, however, the identification challenge in this context is that the selection of co-inventors is not a random process. So thus, in order to disentangle these potential selection and treatment effects, let me specify exactly the empirical methodology that we are using to obtain credibly causal estimates of the effect of team cultural diversity on team inventor output. And so the idea is to start with 2 inventor teams, where one is the eventually treated team T that suffers a co-inventor death, and the other is a matched counterfactual control team C that A, must be working at the same firm as the treated inventor team, B, has the same number of inventors in the team as the treated team in the pre-treatment period, C, the control team must be actively working together around the time of the focal co-inventor's death. So in other words, we require that the control team must have patterned together at least once in the 3 years leading up to the focal co-inventor's death. And finally, the chosen counterfactual control team C will be closest to the treated team in terms of its cultural diversity in the pre-treatment period. So then at time 0, only treated team T is hit with the exogenous shock of prematurely losing their colleague, which following Jaravell 2018, we define premature deaths as deaths of inventors that occur at 60 years of age or younger, while control team C remains intact throughout the treatment period. So as a result, we are going to compare the innovation outcomes of team T and team C in the post-turnover period relative to differences between the same team T and team C in the pre-turnover period. So however, what is interesting about our empirical setup is that inventor team cultural diversity can increase or decrease depending on who in the original team passes away. And so we're going to exploit this fact in our triple difference in difference methodology that I'll explain on the next slide. So in total, there are a little over 1,000 treated teams working at US publicly listed firms between 1981 and 2011 that suffered the exogenous shock of losing their co-inventor, with a corresponding number of counterfactual control teams that do not experience a co-inventor death during the corresponding test period. So as alluded to previously, we use the following triple difference in difference specification where we compare changes in innovative output after an inventor team's culture diversity decreases following the death of a co-inventor vis-a-vis cases where an inventor team's cultural diversity increases after a co-inventor death. So in particular, we define the indicator variable after which equals 1 for all years after the focal co-inventor's death and 0 otherwise. The indicator variable treated team, which equals 1 for all teams that experience the shock of losing a co-inventor and 0 otherwise. And the indicator variable team culture distance drops, which equals 1 for treated teams that experience a decline in their team's cultural value diversity after their co-inventor's death, and 0 otherwise. And so the key coefficient for us in this specification is beta 4, which is on the interaction term after times treated team times team cultural distance drops, which compares the pre and post death impact relative to the counterfactual control teams for treated team innovation performance for cases where the treated team's cultural diversity increases after a co-inventor's death, vis-a-vis cases where the treated team's cultural diversity increases after the co-inventor's death. So as part of this regression setup, we include team fixed effects to difference away any time invariant team level characteristics and year fixed effects to absorb any sort of common time effects that for teams that experience either an increase or a decrease in the cultural diversity of their remaining team members. And so furthermore, we incorporate a variety of control variables comprising so-called inventor team average control variables. So namely average total patents per team member, average co-inventor experience, average number of different technological classes patented in, as well as the average forward citations and backward citations per patent for each team member. And we then also include a variety of inventor team diversity control variables, including team gender diversity and team geographic diversity, as well as the corresponding standard deviation across team members' prior patents, experience, and citations that are included in the average team control variables discussed previously. So here are the results of difference in difference specification to examine if there are any changes in the quality or quantity of innovation output where there are exogenous changes in the cultural value composition of inventor teams. And so focusing on column 1, we see that inventor teams that experience a decrease in the level of team cultural diversity, either remaining team members become less culturally distant from one another, seem to significantly increase the quantity of patents that they produce. And so this is consistent with the organizational behavioral theory that it's relatively easier to produce immediate quantifiable output when team members share common perspectives. And then to examine whether there's any potential trade-off between the quality and quantity of patents, we examine if there's any significant changes in forward sites for patents or the average market value of patents for treated teams that experience an increase or decrease in cultural diversity post their co-inventor's death, and we don't seem to find any significant changes there. So the important thing, however, to note about these overall average level innovation outcomes is that they hide some key nuances about how changes in team cultural diversity affects our future innovation. So in particular, what we show in column 1 and column 2 of this table is that teams that become less diverse after their co-inventor's death are relatively more likely to produce more exploitative patents, while teams that are more diverse are relatively more likely to produce more exploratory patents. And so this is consistent with the idea that greater homogeneity in cognitive thought processes is more likely to push teams towards sort of pursuit in knowledge areas that they're more familiar with, versus teams that are more diverse seem to more likely engage in more risky research pursuits outside the boundaries of their existing knowledge. And furthermore, as shown in column 3, while less culturally diverse teams produce a higher overall quantity of patents that are moderately successful, we also find evidence that more culturally diverse teams produce a greater share of high impact innovations as measured by the number of patents that fall in the top 10% of the future patent citation distribution. And so while more culturally diverse teams are more likely to seem to engage in failed research endeavors, whether measured in terms of a decrease in numbers of patents generated or an increased likelihood of producing patents that are not highly valued by the scientific or investor community, more culturally diverse teams seem to have a greater ability to produce more breakthrough innovations. So in the interest of time, I'll just briefly describe one sort of robustness test that we do in this context. So a potential objection to our difference in difference specification with match control teams approach described previously is that it's unreasonable to compare the innovation trajectory of a treated inventor team that suffers the upheaval and numerical disadvantage of losing their co-inventor due to premature death. And comparing that to the innovation trajectory of a counterfactual control team that does not experience such turmoil. And so here we run, to overcome this, we run a heterogeneous treatment effects specification where we only compare innovation outcomes for treated teams whose cultural diversity declines after a co-inventor death versus treated teams where cultural diversity increases after a co-inventor death. And so in the interest of time, what we find is that we attain similar results as before, where more culturally homogenous teams seem to produce more incremental exploitative patterns that are more moderately successful, while more culturally diverse teams seem to produce a higher share of more risky explorative patterns. And so to sort of briefly conclude, in this paper, we believe that our focus on the most critical element of the corporate R&D process, namely inventors who are ultimately responsible for creating novel technologies, allows us to identify some of the underlying drivers of productivity in internal labour markets and thus corporate innovation. And then using our unique within firm setup, we first find that shared cultural values and shared gender are important drivers of collaboration choices, even within the same corporate office. And second, we find that there are important economic trade-offs, at least from an innovation productivity perspective, in the pursuit of greater workplace diversity, where while we show that more diverse teams seem to have a greater ability to produce more exploratory, high-impact innovations, it's important to acknowledge that more diverse teams are also relatively more likely to engage in failed research pursuits. And so as such, our results would imply that each firm will have a different and potentially time-varying optimal mix of culturally homogenous and diverse teams in order to produce the desired combination of exploratory versus exploitative innovation. So thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to Francisco's discussion and any other questions that people may have.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Tristan.